Imagine walking through the ancient floodplains of Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE. The sun is relentless, the mud beneath your feet clings like wet clay, and the scent of river water mixes with the aroma of freshly cut barley. You are a Sumerian farmer, a crucial cog in the earliest known agrarian society. But your task isn't just sowing grain, it's navigating a minefield of taboos that could, in your neighbor's eyes, curse the entire harvest. Among the strangest of these was a lingering distrust of a particular vegetable, the cucumber. To modernize, this seems laughable. But for the ancient Sumerians, cucumbers held an oddly ominous reputation. Unlike barley, dates, onions, and garlic, staples revered for their dependability, cucumbers were unpredictable, quick to rot, and prone to disease. Their high water content made them fragile in the dry heat. More troubling, however, was their shape and sudden growth spurts. One day the vine seemed still. The next, the cucumber bulged unnaturally overnight. For a people attuned to cycles of rain and grain, this felt like a violation of natural order. Sumerians were deeply spiritual, and every element of daily life was entangled with their pantheon of gods. Enlil, the sky god, determined weather. Enki ruled water. Utu, the goddess of vegetation, was believed to bless crops, but only those deemed worthy and sacred. Cucumber vines, unruly and undomesticated by comparison, were associated with chaos. Some texts even record warnings that cucumber fields must not be planted too close to temples, lest they offend the gods with their odor or wild growth. Cuneiform tablets from cities like Lagash and Ur offer tantalizing glimpses into this tension. A tablet listing temple offerings makes no mention of cucumbers, even as it inventories everything from leeks to lentils. Another legal text from the early dynastic period warns tenants against planting vegetables that disturb the peace of the gods. Though it doesn't specify cucumbers, some scholars believe this was a veiled reference, but the root of the fear might not have been religious at first. It could have been medical. You see, cucumbers in their wild form contain compounds like cucurbitacins, which can cause digestive distress or bitterness if improperly cultivated. Early farmers likely had inconsistent results when growing them. A few unfortunate experiences, illness after a meal perhaps, might have led to broader societal suspicion. And in a world without germ theory, such reactions would quickly become spiritual or social warnings. It's worth noting that the Sumerians were extremely pragmatic people. Their invention of writing was primarily to manage grain stores and livestock counts, not poetry or philosophy. But when it came to the unknown, when a crop turned sour or grew strangely, rationality yielded to ritual. Cucumbers became scapegoats. Priests would even perform minor cleansing rites after accidental cucumber harvests in some temple lands. Perhaps the most curious artifact linked to this fear is a small clay figurine found near Eridu, depicting a man kneeling, holding a long, oval object in outstretched hands. Some interpret this as a religious offering. Others argue it might be a symbolic gesture of repentance. Perhaps the farmer, shamed for cultivating a forbidden crop, was attempting to appease a local deity. But was it truly fear, or simply a case of early agricultural caution dressed in myth? As urban life spread and Sumerian society evolved, the role of vegetables changed. Trade introduced new foods, new rituals, and possibly new attitudes. But in these early centuries, the cucumber remained a symbol of the chaotic and unknown. Creeping, watery threat lurking among the predictable rows of barley. So why were cucumbers so feared? Was it disease? Was it divine suspicion? Or perhaps something stranger? In the ancient city of Nippur, spiritual matters governed everything, from the timing of a harvest to how a farmer might wash his hands after touching certain vegetables. Nippur wasn't just another city-state, it was one of the holiest sites in Sumer, home to the Akur temple complex dedicated to Enlil, the chief god of the pantheon. Here, taboos weren't folklore, they were doctrine. And among the lesser taboos, whispered through the temple's clay brick corridors was this: the vine of the serpent must not enter the sacred field. The serpent vine was a euphemism. Most scholars now agree it referred to cucumber plants. The metaphor made sense. Cucumbers coiled along the ground, snaked through gardens, and sprouted fruit in unexpected places. Their erratic behavior was unnerving to a priesthood obsessed with control and purity. Temple scribes and officials kept extensive records, and many of these tablets detail food offerings for festivals, sacrifices, and daily rituals. Notably, cucumbers are conspicuously absent. While garlic, onion, barley beer, and date cakes were common offerings, cucumbers almost never appear, even when other garden vegetables do. It wasn't just a question of availability, it was intentional exclusion. When cucumbers were mentioned, it was often in a context of cleansing, avoidance, or illness. One medical text, part of the so-called therapeutic series uncovered in Ashurbanipal's later library, but originally based on older Sumerian knowledge, lists cucumbers among items to pass swiftly from the bowels, warning that they may bring bitter humors if offered to a restless stomach. That phrase, bitter humors, reflects an early understanding of bodily balance, something later echoed in Greek and Roman medicine. But to the Sumerians, such disturbances weren't just physical, they were spiritual imbalances. And in a world where crop failure, disease, or even infertility might be blamed on divine anger, no one dared flirt with agricultural offense. 1. Curious passage from a purification ritual speaks of the green thing that suckles from mud and steals the water of wiser plants. The language is poetic, but the meaning is clear. Cucumbers were invasive, greedy, and suspicious. They were not to be cultivated near temple lands and certainly never brought inside for ritual purposes. Even the method of handling cucumbers was ritualized in some communities. Archaeologists believe that in places like Umma, farmers may have been required to segregate cucumber patches behind low reed fences, effectively placing them in quarantine. This wasn't a matter of farming convenience, it was symbolic isolation. They were a tolerated nuisance, like a relative invited to the wedding but seated far from the main table. The fear extended beyond the spiritual. Sumerian society had bureaucratic layers that would rival modern governments. Land records were detailed. Taxation was calculated down to the bundle. If your land grew cucumbers, even unintentionally, you might be flagged for review, especially if your field was near temple boundaries. Officials were wary. In one recovered tablet from the time of King Ur-Nanshe, a boundary dispute references a farmer who let the serpent plant trespass the line of barley. The language is dramatic, but so was the social context. He was fined 5 shekels, no small penalty for a laborer. More than just suspicion or metaphor, the cucumber represented social anxiety, and yet, not everyone feared it. In private gardens, behind ordinary homes, some grew cucumbers freely. Not every Sumerian saw them as taboo. There are fragments of love poems likening a young man's virility to a fruit that grows unseen in shadow. Even here, though, the cucumber is coded as something hidden, risky, desirable perhaps, but not for public ritual. A personal indulgence, not a civic staple. There is also the possibility that cucumbers were tied to older, pre-Sumerian fertility rituals, remnants of which still lingered in folk beliefs but were shunned by the more orthodox temple orders. If so, the priest's fear wasn't just about the plant's biology, it was about what it symbolized, older, uncontrolled religious ideas. So as cities grew and irrigation expanded, and as food production became more centralized and professionalized, the cucumber remained a liminal food, neither fully rejected nor openly embraced. A food that was eaten quietly, planted discreetly, and occasionally feared symbolically. But what happens when fear and superstition conflict with necessity? By the late Sumerian period, environmental pressures increased. Climate fluctuations, salinization of farmland, and growing population demands began to reshape agricultural priorities. The luxury of avoiding crops due to taboo began to fade. Farmers sought hardier varieties, and sometimes cucumbers filled the gap. This transition wasn't without resistance. Priests pushed back. Some towns clung to the old prohibitions while others quietly redefined them. One priestly commentary from the city of Lhasa records a compromise. Let the cursed vine be grown, but not within sight of the temple wall. Like so many moments in history, adaptation came not through revolution, but through silent, uneasy adjustment. By the end of the 3rd millennium BCE, the cucumber had started to lose its stigma, at least in practice, but memory lingers. Even centuries later, in Akkadian and Babylonian writings that inherited Sumerian traditions, subtle echoes remain. Phrases like "to plant the bitter vine" persisted as idioms for taking foolish risks or inviting unwanted chaos. So what became of the cucumber's infamy? Did time erase it entirely? Or did something survive in whispered phrases, unspoken habits, and quiet corners of the garden? As the 3rd millennium BCE faded into the 2nd, a slow evolution took place in the sun-baked cities of Sumer. Where once fear clung to creeping vines and silent judgments hovered over vegetable beds, something began to shift. Not all at once, but like silt settling after a flood. The cucumber, once the forbidden fruit of the irrigation ditches, began to make its way cautiously back into daily life. It wasn't as though a single event overturned the taboo. There was no grand proclamation from a high priest that declared, "Cucumbers are now clean." Rather, the pressures of ecology and empire chipped away at the stigma. Increasing soil salinity in southern Mesopotamia had rendered parts of the land less viable for barley, Sumer's lifeblood. In response, farmers began experimenting with supplementary crops, often under duress. Cucumbers, with their vine-like growth and shallow root systems, proved remarkably resilient in fallow or secondary plots. They required careful irrigation, yes, but they could be grown in tighter quarters and harvested quickly. For a civilization increasingly anxious about food security, that mattered more than theology. By the time of the Ur III dynasty, circa 2100 BCE, temple records begin to reflect this slow shift. A newly translated tablet from Ummah includes a curious note in its ration list: 1 basket cucumbers, allotted to lower priests, not for altar. The distinction is subtle but important. Cucumbers were still unfit for ritual, but not for consumption. The vegetable had been demoted from cursed to mundane. This marks the quiet rehabilitation of the cucumber in Sumerian life. It started in the shadows, literally. Cucumbers were often grown behind walls or along the edges of garden plots, hidden from the main thoroughfares or temple eyes. Even after practical acceptance, symbolic caution remained. In urban centers, scribes and priests may have still raised eyebrows at their presence. But in rural areas and among the laboring classes, cucumbers became a minor dietary staple. One recovered letter from a grain administrator named Namtar Ili to a temple overseer is particularly telling. In it, he complains that a team of temple workers had grown lazy and sleep in the shade of the vine instead of sorting barley. That he names the vine at all, and implies it has become a source of rest, not fear, suggests how far attitudes had softened. By the early Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, cucumbers had crossed a cultural threshold. They appear in more inventory lists, more domestic garden plans, and even in a few culinary fragments. One recipe, written in Akkadian but rooted in older Sumerian techniques, instructs the cook to mash cucumbers with yogurt and mint, likely a kind of early raita. Or tzatziki. Far from cursed, the vegetable had become more refreshing. Even so, old beliefs rarely vanish completely. In some rural regions, cucumber plants were still avoided during certain lunar phases. Superstitions held that harvesting them under a full moon would lead to withering crops or sudden illness. Children were warned not to trample cucumber vines, lest they bring Enlil's winds into the house. The language had changed, but the caution remained. The story of the cucumber in Sumerian history is not about the plant itself. It is about the stories people wrapped around it, the meanings, the fears, and the shifting balance between myth and necessity. In a society that codified everything, contracts, taxes, marriages, even dreams, it is telling that cucumbers went from unnamed taboos to quietly tolerated crops without a single surviving law codifying the change. The transformation happened in the silence between tablets, in the spaces where practical life outpaced written rule. And it is here, in this story of the ordinary made taboo, then redeemed by time, that we glimpse something deeper about early human civilizations. The Sumerians built ziggurats that touched the sky. They etched laws in stone and mapped stars in the night, but they also feared vegetables. They also whispered about vines that grew too fast, and they too had to learn that fear, no matter how old, can rot faster than a cucumber left in the fee. Sanada, the next time you slice one for a salad, imagine a Sumerian priest standing far away, muttering a prayer and shaking his head. What other superstitions, buried in time and tilled under like so much loam, might have once shaped the way our ancestors ate, planted, and feared? When most people picture ancient Babylon, they imagine towering ziggurats, golden gates, and bustling markets filled with fragrant spices and shouting merchants. What they likely don't imagine is the bath bucket. Yet for the average Babylonian, especially in the age of Hammurabi, around 1750 BCE, cleanliness was not just a luxury, it was a civic duty, a social signal, and often a bureaucratic headache. The Babylonians took hygiene seriously, but their version of cleanliness was governed less by soap and more by structure. And that structure was found in the Code of Hammurabi itself. Among the 282 stone-carved laws chiseled onto a basalt pillar, which still survives today in the Louvre Museum, you won't find specific references to baths or bar soap, but what you will find is a culture obsessed with responsibility, contamination, and public order, all of which tie quietly but clearly to hygiene. Start with the infrastructure. The ancient city of Babylon, though more famously rebuilt by Nebuchadnezzar, centuries later, was already a sprawling urban center under Hammurabi's rule. Clay brick homes, narrow alleys, central courtyards, and rooftop living were standard. And nestled into many of these homes, especially among the wealthier classes, was a small feature that tells us a great deal. The bath slab, typically made of baked clay or smooth stone, the bath slab was a raised flat surface with a gentle slope and a small groove for runoff. Next to it, you'd find a bucket, or three, one for clean water, one for used water, and often one with oil ash or a kind of proto-soap made from animal fat and plant ash, sticky, greyish, and mildly caustic. It didn't lather like modern soap, but it cut through grime. Sort of. Bathing wasn't daily, but it was regular, especially before religious rituals, court appearances, or after certain forms of labor. Priests, scribes, and merchants were expected to maintain basic cleanliness, but the reasons weren't always about health. In Babylon, to appear unclean was to appear disorderly, and disorder was practically criminal. While the common laborer might scrub down in a courtyard or at the riverbank, the priest class had far stricter rules. Before entering a temple, priests had to undergo a ritual washing. Water was poured over the head and hands. Specific prayers were recited. In some temples, small purification pools existed, but these were rare and likely reserved for higher rituals. The average clergyman used a bucket, a bowl, and a prayer. Interestingly, temples maintained large water storage jars not just for ritual, but for general cleanliness. The belief was clear. To approach the divine, one must not be caked in the sea. Mud of the mundane. Public cleanliness extended beyond the temples, too. One surprisingly detailed tablet from Sipar outlines fines for households that allow wastewater to spill into the public road. The term used is shikru shumeshu, literally filthy drainage. The fine, 2 shekels of silver. That's a hefty price for bad plumbing. And here lies the bureaucratic brilliance of Babylon. Even bathing became a matter of paperwork. When disputes arose, say a neighbor accused someone of fouling the alley with bathwater, witnesses might be summoned. A scribe could document the offense, and in extreme cases, the local judge might rule in favor of reparations, which could include the accused paying for the replacement of someone's clay sandals. The logic: dirty water ruins shoes, and shoes weren't cheap, but access to clean water wasn't equal. The wealthy could afford regular deliveries from water carriers, young men who filled ceramic jars from canals or cisterns and hauled them through the streets. Their paths were well worn, their services priced by the jar, and their complaints frequent. Too many stairs was a common grumble, echoed even in scribal notes found near residential complexes. For a small tip, they might pour directly into your rooftop tank. For no tip, they might accidentally slosh it onto your dusty courtyard floor. Poorer citizens, of course, fetched their own. Early morning in Babylon often meant a line at the community well or the nearest canal, spout buckets in hand, arguments over whose turn it was. Children were frequently tasked with this chore, especially daughters. And while many sources gloss over it, personal letters on clay tablets sometimes betray parental frustration. My daughter does not rise early to fetch the water, and so the bread burns while she is out, writes one merchant. Babylonian hygiene also had a spiritual side. The gods of cleanliness were minor but present. The god Enki, associated with fresh water, often appeared in purification spells. His symbols were carved onto protective amulets worn during ritual washing or childbirth. In more superstitious households, bath buckets were painted with small snake-like lines, thought to ward off diseases associated with dirty water. Disease, of course, was a real threat. Though the Babylonians had no concept of bacteria, they recognized patterns. Dirty streets bred more sickness. Stagnant water caused bad humors. A popular healing spell reads, "May the water cleanse the shadow of sickness and carry it to the waste pit," which brings us to the final step in the Babylonian bathing process, disposal. Wastewater couldn't just be dumped. Regulations, oral or written, required it to be emptied into designated runoff pits or open drains along the city edge. During the dry season, this was manageable. During the rainy season, Babylon turned into a swampy, slippery mess. Complaints about impassable streets and stinking alleys pepper scribble logs, especially from quarters near the canal junctions. Still, the city endured. The people adapted. And slowly the bath bucket became more than just a utilitarian object. It became part of the rhythm of Babylonian life. Tomorrow you might wake up and take a shower without a second thought. But 3,700 years ago, a Babylonian had to consider the angle of the sun, the price of water, the opinion of his neighbors, and whether a local official might fine him for soiling the path. So why did Babylonians go to such lengths just to stay? Clean. Was it health, habit, or hierarchy? For a civilization that gave the world its first written legal code, it's no surprise that the Babylonians also regulated bathing, indirectly, but with obsessive precision. While we may never find a tablet that reads, "Thou shalt scrub behind thine ears," what we do find are hundreds of laws, customs, and civic habits that made personal hygiene a quiet but powerful force in public life. Let's begin with the most curious player in this whole bureaucratic ballet, the public washer. In the temple precincts of major cities like Babylon, Sippar, and Ur, there were men, often former slaves or low-ranking officials, assigned to oversee purification duties. Their official titles are debated by scholars, but cuneiform references call them shukulam mei, or water attenders. Their job wasn't glamorous: clean the temple steps, wash out the ritual pools, refill ceremonial jars, and in rare cases assist priests with pre-ritual baths. But here's the twist: these men had access. They controlled the cleanest water, managed temple channels, and even had influence over who could bathe and when. In a desert culture, this made them minor gatekeepers of sacred hygiene. If you'd angered a priest, you might find yourself waiting a very long time for a bucket to arrive. Even outside the temple, the social cues around cleanliness were woven tightly into daily etiquette. A scribe entering a noble's house would splash water on his sandals before crossing the threshold. Visitors to wealthier homes were sometimes offered a shallow bowl of scented water, a mixture of river water, oil, and herbs. It wasn't meant for drinking. It was for wiping your hands and face. Declining to do so could be seen as an insult. Using too much could be wasteful. Balance was everything. This sense of measured propriety extended to children. There are surviving school tablets from scribal academies, known as edubas, that include practice sentences like, "The good child washes before eating," and "He who dirties his neighbor's courtyard is no gentleman." These were not just maxims. They were foundational to how young Babylonians were trained to behave, especially those destined for careers in law, temple service, or administration. 1. Particularly enlightening source comes from the legal case notes of a judge named Idin Sin. Among his clay docket tablets is an odd dispute involving a broken water jar, a flooded stairwell, and a family feud. A tenant accused her upstairs neighbor of carelessly pouring out bath water, which spilled down into her oven alcove, ruining her bread dough. The outcome? The upstairs neighbor was fined for negligence and ordered to repair the wall plaster. The judge noted, "Cleanliness must not cause disorder." A paradoxical phrase, and yet a deeply Babylonian one. But what about the markets? Here, hygiene was not just encouraged, it was scrutinized. Vendors selling food, perfumes, or linens were expected to appear well-kept. While not a law per se, several complaint tablets refer to merchants who were sweaty, dusty, and foul-smelling. One letter from a customer to a cloth dealer reads, "Your hands stained my robe, for you did not wash them after eating dates." In the merchant class, appearance could make or break a sale. Bathers themselves had to follow strict routines. Baths, whether private or semi-public, were not communal in the Roman sense. Babylonian bathing was modest, controlled, and largely private. Bathing clothes were worn even in the act of washing. Modesty was not just a virtue, it was enforced by social expectations. Those who disrobed openly could be fined, and in temple quarters even expelled soap as we know it didn't exist. But Babylonian texts reference cleansing pastes made from wood ash and fats, sometimes mixed with salt or crushed herbs. These were used sparingly and often doubled as antiseptics for wounds or skin irritations. One recipe, copied onto a clay tablet found near Borsippa, calls for fat of goat, ash of tamarisk, crushed cedar bark, boiled, cooled, and rubbed on with linen. Water, though, was the real currency. As canals silted up or dried, fights over water access became common. Water theft was a crime. So was water poisoning, which could happen if someone dumped animal waste upstream. In one case from Lhasa, a man accused of defiling a community bath by washing his ox cart in it was fined and forbidden from using that canal for 3 months. Even death had a hygienic angle. Before burial, bodies were ritually washed, often with perfumed water if the family could afford it. But more interestingly, a law on a funerary tablet required that the bathing water used to wash a corpse be poured outside the city gate. It could not re-enter any domestic or temple drainage channel. This law wasn't merely sanitary, it was spiritual. Contaminated water was considered unclean on multiple levels, and still not all Babylonians could afford regular washing. The poor and the enslaved made do with canal water, shared buckets, and occasional downpours. One text suggests that some households saved water from morning use to be reused for evening feet washing, a practical solution that also reveals the scarcity many faced. Yet despite all this regulation, resource juggling, and religious prescription, Babylonians kept washing. Why? Because cleanliness was a subtle form of power. It proved your status. It maintained social order. And in a deeply spiritual city, it was part of your offering to the gods. Still, we're left with a curious thought. For a society so obsessed with record-keeping, why was there never a formal law of the bath carved into Hammurabi's great stele? Was it too obvious to warrant law? Or was cleanliness so tightly woven into every part of life that writing it down would have been redundant? By the final centuries of the Old Babylonian period, the sounds of water buckets being filled, sandals being rinsed, and hands being scrubbed had become so ordinary, so routine, that few likely thought about how peculiar it was that a desert. Civilization had become so deeply committed to the idea of cleanliness. But there was an underlying reason. In Babylon, cleanliness wasn't just about appearance or health, it was about harmony. The idea that people, gods, homes, and streets each had their proper place. Cleanliness preserved that order. Dirt, sweat, and disorder, literal or metaphorical, represented chaos, and chaos was the domain of demons, curses, and social decline. This worldview permeated every layer of society. Even children's lullabies occasionally included lines like, "Wash your feet, lest Namtar find them dusty." Namtar was a minor god of fate and disease. To associate dirty feet with his wrath wasn't just poetic, it was instruction. Yet it wasn't only spiritual cleanliness that mattered. Civic order was just as essential. Let's take the example of urban canal maintenance, which might seem far removed from personal hygiene. But these canals didn't just bring water to the fields, they were the lifeblood of Babylonian households. If canals clogged with mud, washing became impossible. If runoff was blocked, waste lingered. If bathwater overflowed into alleyways, neighbors got sick or angry. The city's solution: appoint canal inspectors. Known as bel-may-nare, masters of the water channel, these men were charged with ensuring that waterways were free of obstructions, that homes didn't dump waste improperly, and that drinking and washing areas remained distinct. Offenders could be fined or made to appear before the ensai, a city governor. Some scholars believe these inspectors were also responsible for checking temple purification sites, which would make them early examples of public health officers. And yet, even with all this infrastructure, mishaps still occurred. One humorous yet telling clay tablet found in Mari recounts a minor scandal involving a temple servant who slipped upon the slick path after the washing of the high priest. The servant apparently bruised his hip and lodged a formal complaint demanding compensation. The case was dismissed. The ruling? The water was lawful and sanctified. His feet were not. Such dry wit from ancient scribes shows us a people who not only valued order, but found humor in its occasional collapse. Still, for many Babylonians, the act of bathing was deeply personal. Consider the elderly widow living in a modest home near the outer wall, who boiled her water in a bronze pot each morning. She used a cloth to filter out the grit, added a dash of oil if she had any, and took great care to wash her hands before preparing bread, even if no one would see her. Why? Because it was right. Or the apprentice scribe, nervous on the morning of his first audience with a temple official. He scrubs his hands twice. He rinses his reed stylus in clean water, though no one asked him to. He ties his hair neatly and checks his tunic for dust. Not because he was told to, but because his teacher had once said, "A dirty hand writes lies." In this way, hygiene became more than practice. It was principle. Even in death, the importance of water endured. Tomb inscriptions often included prayers to the gods to grant the deceased access to sweet waters in the afterlife. The phrase was not symbolic alone. It meant peace, rest, and the absence of suffering. For a people who measured their days by how clean their feet were, before sleep, the image of eternal clean water was a kind of paradise. Of course, like all cities, Babylon wasn't perfect. There were floods, droughts, disease outbreaks, periodic collapses in canal systems. Even the best bureaucracies could fail. But the effort to preserve order through washing, scrubbing, fining, and preaching was constant. And the message was simple if you knew where to look. A clean city is a good city. A clean man is a just man. And a just man keeps the gods from turning their gaze elsewhere. So next time you casually wash your hands or enjoy a long bath, think of the Babylonian who, thousands of years ago, had to climb a narrow stairway with a clay bucket, careful not to spill, so that he might arrive clean, not just for himself, but for his city, his god, and the record etched in clay. Was cleanliness just a habit in Babylon, or was it one of the oldest forms of resistance to chaos known to civilization? You walk into the Roman Curia, the stone-walled meeting place of the Senate, sometime in the 1st century CE. The sun glints off polished marble columns. The rustle of togas echoes through the hall. But among the murmurs of political intrigue and philosophical debate, there is another, subtler sound, the faint crackle of parchment, the whisper of papyrus, and the exasperated sigh of a senator, fumbling with yet another scroll. This was the age of imperial paperwork, and if power in Rome was measured by military conquest and public speeches, it was also maintained, quietly, tediously, through the dullest of tools, scrolls, ink, and the unglamorous machinery of documentation. At the heart of Rome's bureaucracy lay a staggering amount of writing. The Romans wrote everything down: census data, tax rolls, military inventories, court records, temple expenditures, and minutes from Senate debates. A law wasn't truly enacted until it was inscribed and archived. A citizen wasn't truly Roman until his name appeared on an official roll. And all of this was managed through a material most of us today associate with ancient grace, the scroll. Elegant in museums, unwieldy in real life. Let's begin with the basics. Roman scrolls volumina were made from papyrus, imported in massive rolls from Egypt. The quality varied, but for state use, they demanded only the finest. Smooth, uniform, sheets glued edge to edge, trimmed and rolled around wooden rods called umbilici. A single scroll might contain a dozen sheets or more. Too short, and it was dismissed as frivolous. Too long, and it became a practical nightmare to handle. Senators and scribes alike struggled with the logistics of these documents. There was no Ctrl plus F in a Roman scroll. If you wanted to find a specific clause in a decree, you had to unroll it slowly, one turn at a time. This process could take minutes or more, especially when the document was written in small, cramped script. Worse still, each scroll could only be read from beginning to end. There was no easy flipping between pages. If you overshot your target, you had to roll it back up and start again. Enter the scribes, notarii, librari, and actuari, whose job it was to write, copy, store, and retrieve these scrolls. Some worked in temples, others in government buildings. A few were highly respected public servants, most were overworked and undervalued, and all of them had to navigate a mountain of scrolls that grew year after year. The real pressure came during Senate meetings, where scrolls acted as both law and memory. Imagine a senator standing up to contest a law passed 30 years ago. He calls on a scribe to retrieve the lex cincia de donis et muneribus. The scribe disappears into a storeroom filled with rows upon rows of labeled cubbyholes. He returns, dusty scroll in hand. But which section is relevant, which clause? No tabs, no index. Just ink and patience. Paper cuts were a real occupational hazard, especially with brittle papyrus. One first-century commentary even notes that scroll wounds to the fingers of scribes shall be treated with oil of fig and wool. These weren't fatal, but in a world without antibiotics, even a minor wound could fester. But the scrolls weren't just physical burdens. They were symbolic ones too. Roman power relied on record-keeping. The famed cursus publicus, or imperial courier system, ran on written orders. Taxation was enforced through census rolls. Citizenship depended on birth registries. And if you found yourself accused of a crime, your fate could hinge on whether a particular scroll, perhaps from a distant province, had arrived in time. Errors, of course, were common. Scrolls smudged. Ink ran in the heat. Scribes misspelled names. Rodents chewed through important documents. One humorous complaint from a provincial governor to Rome laments that a tax scroll had arrived, gnawed at the edges, with vital names lost to the appetite of mice. The Senate's response was predictably slow. A second copy had to be requested. The delay? 4 months. And yet, despite the hassle, scrolls were sacred. Destroying one was tantamount to destroying law itself. Scrolls were stored in special archives, tabularia, guarded by clerks and often protected by rituals. Before placing a scroll in storage, some priests would mark it with a wax seal and utter a blessing. In their view, scrolls preserved the will of the gods as much as the will of men. The physical challenge of the scroll led some to innovate. By the late 1st century, the Codex, a bound book with pages, was emerging in certain circles, especially among early Christians and traveling scholars. Codices were easier to carry, easier to reference, and less prone to injury for both document and reader. But the Senate resisted. Tradition mattered. Scrolls were Roman, so the paper cuts continued. The bureaucratic fumbling persisted, and the archives groaned under their weight. At one point in the reign of Domitian, a frustrated senator proposed a new office, the scrollmaster, whose sole job would be to manage document retrieval and filing. The idea was mocked. "What is next?" one critic wrote. "A senator who cannot read his own hand must not read at all." Still, the idea resurfaced decades later, under a new name, Archivarius. So what does this tell us? That even at the height of Rome's power, its might depended not just on legions and laurels, but on scribes hunched over desks, scrolls stretched across their knees, hunting for a name they half remembered from a meeting they barely attended. Why did Roman senators fear paper cuts? not just because they hurt, but because each cut reminded them how fragile the empire's bureaucracy truly was. Imagine the quiet chaos of a Roman archive, the tabularium, not a library, not exactly. These were not places of quiet reflection and curated knowledge. They were places of dust, of catalogued commands and of brittle papyrus waiting to crack in the wrong hands. The largest of these was in Rome itself, housed beneath the Capitoline Hill. The tabularium, whose stone ruins still exist, was the central repository for senatorial decrees, census records, and laws that shaped the empire. But this was only one of many. Each province had its own administrative center, and each of those held its own set of scrolls. Some towns even had duplicate scrolls made and shipped to Rome for safekeeping, though weather, war, and sloppy scribes ensured many were lost along the way. Inside these archive rooms, the scrolls were stored on wooden shelves or cubbies, often sorted by year, subject, or author. Labels were written on tags of parchment, called tituli, which dangled from the end of the scroll or were tied to the umbilicus rod. But tituli could fall off, ink could fade, and rodents had no respect for administrative order. As a result, the archivists, tabulari, developed their own systems. Some scribbled cross-references in wax tablets, others marked shelves with chalk or carved letters, yet it was never enough. Misfiling was rampant. One notable disaster occurred under the rule of Emperor Tiberius. A flood swept through the lower levels of an administrative building near the Tiber River, soaking hundreds of scrolls. Drying them proved difficult. Mold set in. Entire records were lost, including allegedly a census roll from Hispania. The Senate was forced to send a team of officials to recollect the data door by door. It took over a year. And yet, despite the fragility of their system, Romans doubled down on documentation. The censor, a powerful magistrate responsible for maintaining the census and public morals, kept exhaustive scrolls detailing citizens' ages, landholdings, family connections, and voting eligibility. These records determined tax brackets and military conscription. A misrecorded name could lead to a family paying more than it owed, or being stripped of its voting rights entirely. Citizens who believed their records were incorrect could appeal, but only if the scroll could be found. One documented case from Pompeii involved a freedman named Lucius Tiro, who claimed he was being taxed as a landowner, even though he'd sold his property years before. The scribe in charge searched the archive for his deed of sale, but found only an unsigned copy. Without the original, Lucius was forced to pay. He appealed again, but the correct scroll surfaced 2 years later, found lodged behind a collapsed shelf during a storeroom renovation. The delay cost him a quarter of his wealth. Scribes, too, were not immune to the pressures of the job. Some scribes wore gloves of thin wool or linen to avoid the sharp edges of dried papyrus, especially when working long hours. Others dipped their fingers in oil to prevent ink from smearing and scroll fibers from snagging. Injuries from splinters in wooden scroll rods or cuts from frayed papyrus were common enough that medical writers like Galen mentioned treatment specifically for scroll hand, a repetitive motion injury akin to carpal tunnel. But not all scroll problems were physical. Many were logistical or political. For example, a governor might receive an edict from the emperor written in elegant script, rolled tightly and sealed with wax. But if the scroll arrived without the imperial stamp, the signet ring's impression, it could be declared void, even if the contents were authentic. A delivery error, a smear of wax, or a missing cord could mean a month of governance undone. Worse still was the issue of forgery. With so many scribes copying so many documents, it was difficult to guarantee authenticity. Some unscrupulous officials were known to insert false clauses into existing decrees, roll them back up and reseal them. By the time anyone noticed, years might have passed. One senator accused a rival of doing just that, altering a land grant decree to include his nephew's name. A tribunal was formed. The scroll was examined, recopied, and compared to distant duplicates in Gaul. The case was never resolved, and yet the empire kept writing. By the time of Trajan, scrolls were so central to Roman life that imperial scribes were granted exemptions from military service. Their work, copying, filing, reading, was considered essential to the functioning of the state. Some of these scribes worked in shifts around the clock, especially during major administrative transitions or post-census years. Scrolls were even transported across the empire in special chests called capsae, often locked and marked with lead tags. These were carried by government couriers on horseback, sometimes guarded by soldiers if they contained sensitive political orders. In one remarkable case, a courier carrying a capsa filled with scrolls for the eastern provinces fell ill on the road. The scrolls sat for days in a villa's storeroom until a second courier was dispatched. The delay cost a provincial governor his term. His replacement had already arrived by the time the message reached him. Such stories show just how tenuous Roman bureaucracy could be. For all its grandeur, the empire's machinery depended on ink that could fade, wax that could crack, and paper that could rip. Still, the Romans persisted, because scrolls, flawed though they were, gave structure to chaos. They made it possible for Rome to govern territories thousands of miles away, to collect tribute from tribes they'd never meet, to issue justice in absentia, and to remember the names of citizens long after they'd died. But it's easy to wonder, how? Many scrolls were lost. How many truths vanished between the shelves? And how much of Rome's vast power rested on a stack of brittle, curling documents, one paper cut away from crumbling? By the 2nd century CE, the Roman Empire was at its territorial peak. Roads stretched from Hadrian's Wall to the banks of the Euphrates. Governors managed distant provinces. Legions enforced law, and taxes flowed into Rome like the tides of the Tiber. But behind the military triumphs and architectural splendor stood a fragile empire of scrolls. Every law, census, tax receipt, deed, and proclamation had to be written, filed, read, and, when the time came, retrieved. And the longer the empire lasted, the heavier the weight of its paperwork became. The scroll had become both a symbol of Rome's order and its quiet Achilles' heel. You see, scrolls weren't built to last. Papyrus decays, ink fades, fire devours everything. Yet Rome depended on scrolls to maintain continuity, through regime changes, wars, earthquakes, and floods. An emperor's policy, a family's legal status, even a man's right to own land or speak in court, these could all hinge on the survival of a single brittle document. And so archivists became guardians not just of records but of reality. One famous case from the reign of Emperor Antoninus Pius involves a boundary dispute in North Africa. Two towns claimed ownership of a valuable wellspring. The argument dragged on for years until a single scroll surfaced in Rome's central archive. It was faded, partially illegible, and stained with what some believed was ancient oil. But it contained just enough information, an imperial ruling from the time of Augustus, to settle the dispute. The town that lost. It appealed, citing the document's poor condition. Rome's answer was terse. The scroll has spoken. But what happened when the scrolls themselves failed? They often did. The Great Fire of 192 CE, during the chaotic reign of Commodus, destroyed large portions of Rome's administrative buildings. Thousands of scrolls vanished. Birth records, Senate votes, military commendations. Entire families lost proof of citizenship. Displaced officials had to swear affidavits. In some cases, veterans were denied pensions because the army could no longer find their enlistment documents. The Senate commissioned scribes to recreate the most essential records, but much was never recovered. By then, many scribes and administrators were pushing for a change already in quiet circulation: the Codex. Unlike scrolls, codices could be opened flat. You could flip through pages quickly. They were easier to carry, easier to copy, and less prone to damage. Early Christians had embraced the format for their scriptures, and legal scholars soon followed. Some magistrates began issuing local edicts in codex form, bound with wooden covers and stitched parchment sheets. The resistance from Rome's elite was immediate. Scrolls were tradition. Scrolls were Roman. The Senate resisted codices not because they were impractical, but because they were new and in their minds foreign. One senator, Plinius Marcellus, wrote dismissively of the Codex, "A book is for a child's lesson. The scroll is for law." But the tide was turning. By the 3rd century, even imperial decrees were sometimes issued in both forms: a scroll for tradition, a codex for practicality. Over time, the codex won, quietly, inevitably, and with that shift, something strange happened. Rome's bureaucratic machinery got faster. Documents became easier to transport, errors declined, retrieval sped up. And slowly, the job of the scribe began to change. No longer just a transcriber or scroll roller, the scribe became a record manager, a proto-clerk, a bureaucratic professional. But the reverence for the scroll never fully faded. Even centuries later, when Rome had splintered and the Western Empire had collapsed, scrolls still lingered in libraries and private collections. Monks in the early Middle Ages copied what they could, sometimes onto codices, other times onto new scrolls. Much of what we know about Roman law, administration, and daily life comes from these fragile survivors. And yet, how many more stories were lost? How many laws vanished because a scroll was misfiled? How many injustices were never corrected because the proper name could not be found? How many voices from the ancient world crumbled between the fingers of a nervous clerk? In the end, the scroll is a symbol of memory, of authority, of bureaucracy at its most human. The empire believed it could preserve truth with ink and papyrus, but time reminded it again and again that permanence is an illusion. So the next time you misplace a document or lose a file on your computer, take a moment to imagine a Roman scribe in a dimly lit archive, fingers nicked and dusty, praying to find a name before the Senate's patience runs out. And ask yourself, did Rome fall with the sword or with the scroll? It's a misty morning in 13th century England. The roads are thick with mud and smoke curls lazily from the thatched roofs of village cottages. You're a tenant farmer, neither a noble nor quite a serf, owing labor and taxes to your lord. As you prepare to visit the manor to report your dues, you grab the one thing that proves what you've paid and what you still owe: a worn linen pouch filled with pebbles. In the modern world, accounting conjures images of spreadsheets and calculators. But in the Middle Ages, especially for the rural poor, numbers lived not on paper, but in stones, carved sticks, and whispered memory. And that's where the story of medieval pebble counting begins, while monasteries and royal courts had clerks. Trained in Latin and arithmetic, the vast majority of peasants were illiterate. Arabic numerals had only just begun to reach Europe, and they were mistrusted by many, seen as foreign and prone to fraud. Roman numerals still dominated formal writing, but they were too cumbersome for everyday calculations. And so the common folk turned to simpler, tactile systems. Pebbles, real smooth stones, served as a surprisingly effective method of record-keeping. These weren't just random rocks. Families often selected specific pebbles to represent particular values: a white one for a penny, a red one for a half-day's labor, a grey for a sack of barley. Some were etched with simple marks, lines, dots, or initials to indicate their purpose. They were stored in bags or wrapped in cloth, and they travelled with the peasant to the manor hall, the mill, or the tithe barn. To outsiders, it might have looked like superstition or nonsense. But to the villagers, each stone was a line in a ledger, silent, portable, and personal. Sometimes these pebbles were used in conjunction with tally sticks, another low-tech yet brilliant invention. The tally stick was typically a piece of hazelwood, notched along one edge to represent units owed, often for taxes, rents, or debts. The stick would then be split down the middle, producing two matching halves. The lord kept one, the tenant kept the other. Neither half alone could be forged, and the notches would always align. Pebbles worked in much the same way, less formal than tally sticks, but just as binding in the minds of those who used them. Manorial records from the 1200s sometimes reference these tools. In one such entry from the estate of the Bishop of Winchester, a Reeve village manager reports, "John of Locksley hath paid in full, as shown by the pebbles of his purse and the word of 3 men." Oral testimony and tangible tokens carried real legal weight. But pebble counting wasn't just about taxes, it was also used in daily trade. At markets, a buyer might set a pebble beside a basket to show intention to purchase. At the alehouse, regulars used pebbles to keep track of how many mugs they'd drunk, a practice that tavern keepers found far more reliable than memory, especially late into the evening. In some monasteries, even monks used small pebbles to mark progress in repetitive prayers, dropping a stone from one bowl to another with each recitation. In this way, counting became almost meditative, even holy. But the pebble system had its flaws. Stones could be lost, confused, or deliberately altered. A clever peasant might swap a high-value pebble for a low one, hoping the Lord's reeve didn't notice. Conversely, a dishonest bailiff might claim a payment was short when it was not. Disputes arose often, which is why village gatherings sometimes included public counting ceremonies, where witnesses observed and confirmed the contents of each pouch. These rituals, while tedious, reinforced trust. "Let each man bring his stones," reads one village proclamation from a Yorkshire manor roll, "and let his neighbours stand to vouch for their weight and truth." Still, reliance on such a rudimentary system highlights the deep divide between medieval literacy and oral culture. In cities and courts, literacy grew. Merchants kept ledgers, scribes copied accounts, and cathedral schools began teaching the basics of arithmetic. But in the countryside, where 9 in 10 people lived, numbers remained abstract, something you could feel in your hand, not write on parchment. And so the pebble endured. In times of scarcity or social upheaval, its simplicity became its strength. When famine struck, peasants used pebbles to track dwindling stores. During plague years, with so many dead that proper accounts couldn't be kept, villages returned to basic methods: stones for food, sticks for debts, memory for everything. Else, perhaps most fascinating is how long this practice persisted. Even into the 16th century, some English villages still used pebbles for seasonal tallies, especially among older farmers. A royal tax survey from 1540 complains that certain old men do reckon by pouch and stone, giving no figure nor name to their debts. It was said with scorn, but also some awe, because at its heart, pebble counting wasn't about ignorance. It was about trust in the tangible, a world where numbers were physical, not abstract, where memory and material merged, and where your entire economic history might sit quietly in a bag at your belt. But this raises an important question. In a world of ink and ledgers, could something as small as a stone still carry the weight of a man's word? In the dim light of a manor court hall, surrounded by wooden beams and the sour scent of wool cloaks and damp earth, villagers gather not just for trials and disputes, but for accounting. Not the noble kind done with ink pots and clerks, but the kind done with pebbles. Once or twice a year, local lords or their stewards held accounting sessions, where tenants reported what they owed and what they'd delivered. Often this included labor, called boon work, livestock, produce, or coin. But not every transaction was logged in ink. In many villages, stones and sticks still spoke for themselves. At these sessions, it was common for each tenant to bring their memory pouch, a bag containing carefully chosen pebbles. Some bags jingled with smooth river stones, others bore scratched or painted markings. For each obligation, say 5 days' work in the field or 3 hens owed at Michaelmas, a corresponding pebble represented it. When presenting accounts, the tenant might empty his pouch into a wooden bowl, calling out each obligation as he did. 1 white stone, labor at barley planting; 1 grey stone, shearing the sheep; 1 round stone, use of the Lord's plough team. The steward watched. The reeve confirmed. Other villagers listened. Discrepancies led to questions. Occasionally, someone forgot a stone, or brought too few. This wasn't always seen as deceit. Sometimes forgetfulness or hardship explained it. But in repeat cases, fines were levied, sometimes small, an extra day's labor. Sometimes large, exclusion from land next year. Pebbles became more than tools. They became legal testimony. The reliance on tactile accounting came partly from distrust of written records. Many villagers couldn't read. Even if a clerk wrote down the correct sum, how would a tenant ever know? The pebble method, in contrast, was visible and communal. The entire village could see it, understand it, and weigh in. This communal aspect helped resolve conflict. In one well-documented case from the manorial court of the Abbey of Glastonbury, early 14th century, a tenant named Elric was accused of underreporting his labor dues. He claimed to have fulfilled his tasks, and to prove it, brought out his pouch. Before the court, he placed 8 marked pebbles on the table. The bailiff contested the count. "You owe 10. Elric's neighbor, a man named Tom the Carter, stepped forward. "I saw him twice at barley harvest and once mending the fence. That makes 8. The court accepted it. Elric's pebbles, combined with Tom's testimony, held more sway than the steward's assumption. Judgment. No fine. This wasn't rare. In fact, communal memory and peer verification were central to justice in the medieval countryside. Stones were reliable because everyone watched them. Pebbles didn't lie, but people might, and so every pouch was subject to public scrutiny. At the heart of the pebble economy was the belief that trust was built on transparency, a very different model than the centralized written bureaucracy developing in towns and royal courts. In cities, money changed hands with receipts. In villages, it changed with the clink of stones in a hand. Some villages even evolved complex systems using color and shape: small, round black stones, single labor days, flat white pebbles, livestock, often hens or geese, jagged grey rocks, fines, owed smooth red stones, completed tithes. The materials varied regionally. Coastal villages might use seashells instead of stones. Highland communities favored carved wood or bone chips. In all cases, the principle was the same: assign a physical item to a debt and let memory do the rest. Of course, this system had limits. It was local. It didn't scale. Lords who managed dozens of manors preferred written tallies, which could be sent back to a central chamberlain. As feudal society grew more sophisticated, so did its ledgers. From the 12th century onward, some lords began sending clerks with ink into the villages, slowly phasing out the old ways. But change met resistance. One clerk, writing in the margins of a manorial roll from Lincolnshire, lamented, "They bring stones in sack and swear they have paid, but no mark do they leave for me. These folk are as pebbled as the stream bed," and yet the pebbles persisted. In part, this was because peasants didn't trust the clerks, and often with good reason. Literacy created power gaps. A crooked bailiff could write anything into a ledger. A forgotten line might erase a tenant's claim, but no one could erase a stone once shown to the whole village. Still, time marched on. By the late 1300s, the rise of written receipts, official seals, and professional reeves diminished the pebble's legal power. Yet even as formal accounting took hold, peasants kept their pouches, not for law but for memory. Farmers used pebbles to track how many eggs had been collected, or how many sheep had returned from pasture. Midwives used stones to count contractions during labor. Shepherds kept tallies of wolves seen or lambs born. The stone's strength was in its immediacy. It needed no parchment, no literacy, just a hand and a habit. There's something deeply human in that, because even today we use tokens to track the intangible. Fitness apps with rings, beads on bracelets, punch cards at coffee shops. We like to see our progress, our debts, our lives in small countable objects. So the pebble wasn't primitive. It was honest. It made abstract things real. But as literacy spread and bureaucracy hardened, the pebble faded from law. The question remains: when the world began to write everything down, what was lost when we stopped counting with our hands? By the dawn of the 15th century, the once familiar sound of pebbles clinking in linen pouches had grown rare in many corners of England and Europe. In towns, and increasingly in the countryside, ink had replaced stone. The scribes had come. The shift didn't happen all at once. In some places it took generations, but the transformation was unmistakable. Accounting had moved off the table and into the ledger. What caused this change? Partly it was pressure from above. The growing power of centralized monarchies, especially in France and England, demanded standardized record-keeping. Kings wanted more predictable taxes. Nobles wanted clearer control over estates. Courts wanted consistent documentation of debts and oaths, and that meant writing, lots of it. With the rise of written contracts, pebble-based accounting began to look dangerously informal. If a lord disputed what a peasant owed, he could now point to a document signed and sealed in wax. In contrast, a peasant with a few marked stones and a neighbor's word held no legal standing in the growing paper empire. The justice system, which had once accepted testimony and tokens, began demanding signatures and parchment. But something subtler was lost in the process. The pebble system had been relational. Everyone saw the same pouch. Disputes were settled, not by examining handwriting, but by watching how many stones fell into the bowl. It was slow, yes, and localized, but it was deeply human. As the written word replaced oral testimony, trust shifted from the body to the page, from shared experience to silent ink. A world that once relied on communal memory began to divide itself, those who could write and those who couldn't. The latter, most peasants, found themselves increasingly at the mercy of literate bailiffs, reeves, and clerks. Legal protections faded, errors were harder to catch, and complaints could be dismissed with a wave of a quill. This was not a conspiracy. It was progress, but the kind that leaves certain people behind. Still, some resisted. In isolated villages, the pebble system endured well into the 1500s. Folk customs clung to their old logic. Farmers still counted lambs with pebbles. Millers dropped stones into bowls for each sack of grain processed. Alewives still kept drinking stones by the hearth, each one a tally for a regular customer's weekly tab. These habits weren't just nostalgic. They were practical. Stones were free. Ink was expensive. Clerks could be bribed or biased. Pebbles had no agenda. Some priests even embraced the practice. One parish record from Kent in 1538 notes that the vicar used pebbles to track baptisms, until the bishop demanded a written register. The vicar complied, but reportedly kept the stones anyway, for God's account. Yet the writing was on the wall, and increasingly on the parchment. By the Elizabethan period, written accounting had become the norm across England and much of Europe. Even the poor had to engage with it. Church registries, land grants, military, drafts all demanded signatures or at least marks. In some manorial rolls, scribes begin to record with faint irritation, "This man says he hath paid, and shows his pouch of stones, but no witness will swear it. Let him come again at Pentecost." This marks the final transition, from memory and mutual trust to external verification, from a world you carried in your hand to one that lived in someone else's book. But even as the legal role of the pebble vanished, its spirit endured. You can still find echoes today. The abacus, still used across parts of Asia, functions on similar principles. Physical counters moving in place to represent numbers. Prayer beads serve a counting function in every major religion. Even tokens like poker chips or arcade coins preserve the tactile truth of value held in the hand. The digital world, too, hasn't truly escaped this instinct. Our fitness trackers buzz, our apps count steps, our calendars show circles that fill in like beads. We still like to touch our progress, because somewhere inside us the peasant survives. A part of us still wants to feel the weight of what we owe, to mark the moments we've given, to hold in something small and solid the proof that we were there. So as you scroll through a spreadsheet or sign a digital invoice, remember the men and women who once stood in smoky village halls, fingers wrapped around small stones, waiting their turn to speak their debts aloud. They didn't have numbers on paper, but they had memory, honesty, and a handful of earth, and in the end, perhaps those stones remembered better than we do. In the grand courts of the Ottoman Empire, beneath domes gilded with gold leaf and tiled in cerulean blue, officials once debated, not war or diplomacy, but cheese. Not the rich white cheeses of today's Anatolian markets, not the lovingly aged wheels of artisan craft. No, this was tax cheese, clotted, sour, hastily pressed, and utterly cursed by the middlemen who handled it. Because in the Ottoman world, dairy wasn't just food, it was money. To understand why, we must step into the world of 16th century rural Anatolia, a region rich with sheep, goats, and pastoral rhythms. Here milk flowed freely in the spring. Herds grazed under the watch of boys with flutes. Milk was churned into yogurt, clarified into butter, and curdled into rough, salted blocks of white cheese, the state noticed. And it wanted a cut. Under the Ottoman system, rural taxes weren't always paid in cash. Farmers and herders paid with what they had: barley, wheat, wool, and, increasingly, cheese. Not just any cheese, state-mandated measured cheese, pressed into round molds and delivered in bulk to military supply depots, garrisons, or even palace kitchens. But as you can imagine, cheese doesn't travel well, especially in the heat of the Levant. Thus began a strange and maddening chapter of Ottoman bureaucracy, the dairy records crisis. Each village was assigned a quota based on herd size and pasture access. Tax collectors would arrive in early summer with ledgers and scales. Cheese was weighed, inspected briefly, recorded and carted off. In theory, it was a brilliant system, fluid, localized, adaptable. In practice, it became a swamp of spoilage, fraud and fermented fury. Let's begin with the middlemen, the multezim, tax farmers who paid the state for the right to collect. Jews. These men, often based in cities, hired agents to travel to the countryside and gather dairy products. The agents were underpaid and poorly trained. Many had never worked a farm. Few knew how to properly preserve cheese. Worse, they often delayed collection until late summer, when supplies were low, and the heat turned the tax hall into a sloshing mess of sour curds. By the time these cheeses reached the army warehouses of Edirne or Damascus, they were often inedible. Molded, rotting, infested with flies. Soldiers refused to eat it. Some buried it. Others, disgusted, sold it to local markets for a few coins, only to be punished for wasting imperial provisions. In one infamous case, a captain stationed in Van sent a letter to Istanbul that simply read, "We received 23 stones of cheese. The smell has made 5 men ill. Kindly advise." Back in the capital, clerks despaired. The scrolls and books of the state were filled with notes. Cheese spoiled upon arrival. Wrong weight delivered. Farmer claims no goats. Mice chewed through storage barrel. Cheese was not cheese. Corruption bloomed. Farmers, desperate to meet quotas, diluted curds with flour or sawdust. Some delivered salted. Yogurt molded into cheese shapes. Others bribed agents with wheels of real cheese, submitting fake bundles to fulfill their official duty. A village near Konya became infamous for sending hollow cheese shells filled with straw. When caught, the elders pleaded ignorance. "The sheep are tired," they wrote. "We thought straw would please the stomach of the soldier just the same." Meanwhile, local resentment simmered. Villagers, already burdened by taxes, saw their best dairy products whisked away, while their families lived off watery yogurt and whey. One peasant woman, in a petition to a local judge, wrote, "They take the butter and leave only sour milk for the babies. This is no justice." Judges, cadis, were often sympathetic. In fact, some began issuing cheese exemptions, especially for widows, smallholders, or those living in highland pastures where dairy was scarce. These exemptions were logged into local court registers called sicils, but these logs rarely reached the capital, creating contradictions in the official records. The imperial scribes hated contradictions. In Istanbul, the Central Finance Bureau, the Defterdar's office, began issuing stricter guidelines. Cheese was to be recorded by type, weight, and animal source. New terms entered the ledgers: kesi peyniri, goat cheese koyun peyniri, sheep cheese inek peyniri, cow cheese tuzuz, unsalted bozuk, spoiled. They even began branding the cheese wheels with fire stamps to trace their origin. But this led to other problems. Branded cheese cracked more easily, mold grew along the burns, and village pranksters began branding rocks or soap blocks to look like tax cheese. Every attempted. Reform only made things worse, and yet, through it all, the cheese kept coming. Spoiled, squishy, smuggled or soured, it was all recorded, tallied and taxed. It was the Ottoman version of paperwork rot, the rotting cheese of empire. It begs the question, how did cheese, humble, local, nutritious, become the symbol of a system collapsing under its own administration? By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman dairy tax had mutated from a manageable nuisance into a full-blown administrative nightmare. What had started as a clever way to provision the military with local products had become one of the empire's most quietly loathed policies, whispered about in the same breath as conscription and grain levies. But unlike soldiers and wheat, whose movements were easily tracked and measured, cheese had a personality problem. No two wheels were the same. Fresh cheese spoiled faster than aged. Cow cheese weighed more than goat. Butter, which could substitute for cheese in some regions, required even more careful handling, and melted in the Anatolian summer heat long before it reached any depot. and so the cheating flourished. The multisim tax farmers knew they couldn't fulfill their quotas honestly, so they adapted. In exchange for bribes, they accepted fake cheese, diluted curds, or partial deliveries. Village elders struck quiet deals. "We give them 1 cheese for the books," said a farmer in a record, "from Sivas, and 1 for their stomachs." In the highlands of eastern Anatolia, entire communities began boycotting the dairy tax by quietly converting to other goods. Some paid in wool, others in dried fruit. Local judges sometimes allowed it, others did not. In one extreme case, a group of farmers in Erzurum paid their cheese quota in salted fish, a gift from neighboring Armenians, sparking a minor investigation and several lashings. But cheese wasn't just a rural problem. In cities like Bursa and Aleppo, the state tried to regulate the sale of cheese in markets. Official inspectors, mutasibs, were assigned to check the weight, freshness, and quality of all dairy sold. They were supposed to prevent cheese fraud, a flourishing side industry in which merchants sold state-provisioned cheese on the black market, often before it ever reached the garrison. These inspectors were feared and resented. One angry shopkeeper called them sniffers of other men's milk. Their methods were crude: knives plunged into wheels, brine tasted by hand, suspicious packages opened with dirty fingers. Their reports were even cruder, marked with terms like shufali, suspicious, kokmush, smelly, or tamam, acceptable. But behind these inspections was a growing reality. The empire didn't trust its own suppliers. To respond, the imperial court introduced one of its most ambitious and disastrous solutions: the Cheese Registry of 1576. This effort aimed to centralize all cheese taxation records. For every village, a full list was made of eligible animals, estimated yield, quota, and delivery window. The registry was copied in triplicate and stored in the finance ministry, provincial capitals, and, when space ran out, in sealed casks aboard ships floating in the Bosphorus. The problems were immediate. Some herders lied about the number of animals. Others claimed drought had dried their goats. Still more bribed clerks to be forgotten. Entire villages vanished from the registry overnight, as if the cheese had eaten the people, one scribe joked in a bitter margin note. But not everyone was laughing. In 1581, the town of Tokat erupted into a cheese riot. The cause? A sudden increase in quotas after a new imperial decree based on inflated population numbers. Tax agents arrived demanding twice the usual cheese. The villagers refused. When forced, they dumped freshly pressed cheese into the town well. The resulting contamination killed several people and ruined the water supply for weeks. The central government responded harshly: fines, floggings, and arrests. But even they admitted the deeper problem. A letter from a provincial governor reads, "The people no longer believe that cheese leaves their village for the soldiers. They say it disappears like butter in the sun." And in many cases, they were right. State warehouses were often corrupt. Soldiers rarely saw the full ration they were promised. Spoiled cheese was dumped or resold. Some garrison commanders began buying cheese from local markets, refusing state shipments altogether. One frustrated captain in Belgrade wrote, "The cheese that arrives is white, yes, but only from mold. We purchase instead from women at the gate." Meanwhile, the clerical apparatus groaned under the weight of its own documentation. Ledgers stacked with contradictory entries, couriers lost on the road, disputes over animal types, weights, and delivery dates. One official complained that he had written the word paneer, cheese, so often that "my fingers now smell of milk and my dreams are salted." Some reformers within the empire saw the problem clearly. A little-known bureaucrat named Ishak Effendi, writing in a 1594 treatise on provincial mismanagement, proposed abolishing the cheese tax entirely. "Let the people sell their cheese and pay in coin," he wrote. The empire should not melt under the weight of dairy. But his proposal was shelved. Too radical, too modern, too French. And so the cheese kept coming and rotting. Soldiers kept vomiting. Villagers kept hiding curds in caves. And the imperial scribes kept writing, stamping, filing, and forgetting. What started as a practical food tax had become a symbol of administrative rot, a soft, crumbling system riddled with contradictions, corruption, and the sour stench of Failed logistics, which leaves us with a question. When the cheese failed to reach the soldier, did the empire still feed its power, or had it already begun to spoil? By the dawn of the 17th century, the Ottoman state had grown tired of smelling like cheese. In military barracks from Bosnia to Baghdad, complaints about spoiled dairy filled the air, literally and administratively. Soldiers mocked their own rations, clerks scribbled sarcastic notes in margins, and poets, ever attuned to the mood of the empire, began composing biting verses. One anonymous satirist in Istanbul wrote, "They tax the milk, they tax the cow, they tax the breath from my sheep's brow. But when the curds reach soldier's plate, it smells more like a stable's fate." Such sarcasm did not go unnoticed. In 1603, Sultan Ahmed I launched a modest reform effort known, ironically to later historians, as the Great Cheese Recalibration. It wasn't sweeping, it wasn't dramatic, but it was the empire's first formal recognition that cheese had somehow become a systemic issue. The reforms included phasing out dairy collection in distant provinces, where spoilage was most common, encouraging cash equivalents in regions with strong local markets, reducing quotas in drought-stricken or high-altitude zones, and most radically, experimenting with wax-sealed cheese barrels to improve long-distance transport. These barrels, modeled after methods used in Venetian sea trade, worked somewhat. Cheese shipped from coastal Anatolia to garrisons along the Danube arrived intact more often, but the system required extra salt, more wood, and longer preparation times. Rural producers, already strained, resisted. So too did some tax farmers, who saw the barrels as harder to skim and resell. As always in the empire, every solution created a new problem. Still, the reforms had their effect. Complaints diminished. Soldiers slowly received higher quality rations, though not always in full. Bribery continued, but more discreetly, and the empire quietly replaced many dairy quotas with coin-based taxation, especially in newly acquired territories like Hungary, where dairy practices differed altogether. But in truth, the damage had been done. The cheese crisis, never a formal war, never a single event, had left deep impressions in the minds of Ottoman officials. Cheese had exposed what many already feared, that the empire's vast and elegant bureaucracy, when strained by geography and greed, could be as soft and prone to collapse as the curds it counted. Historians today view the cheese debacle not as a farce, but as a lens. Through cheese, we glimpse the fragility of logistics in an early modern superpower. We see how poor infrastructure amplifies corruption, how over-centralization alienates local communities, and how something as mundane as dairy can become a battlefield between empire and village, soldier and clerk, fact and fiction. There are deeper questions too. How did a powerful empire lose track of something so simple? Why did it take so long to admit that the system had spoiled? And in trying to preserve order, did the Ottomans end up curdling their own authority? One document, buried deep in the imperial archives, perhaps says it best. A 1617 report from a tax officer reads, "The cheese was taken. The list was signed. The soldiers did not eat it. The people did not trust it, but the books are clean." It's a haunting line, one that captures the distance between paper and reality, between what was collected and what was consumed. A moment when the system functioned, but failed. So next time you unwrap a block of cheese, consider this. That a great empire once struggled to manage it, not because of the cheese itself, but because the empire had grown so vast, so complex, so obsessed with its own records, that it forgot to ask a simple question: is the cheese still good? It is 485 BCE, and the Persian Empire, ruled by Darius I, King of Kings, stretches from the shores of the Aegean Sea to the edges of the Indus River. No other state on earth rivals it in scope. Cities shimmer along its rivers, tribute flows into its palaces, and royal edicts must travel across nearly 3,000 miles of road. But how does a message survive that journey? The answer is not just roads or horses. It is men, couriers, known in Old Persian as piradazish, who rode through dust, storm, snow, and night to keep the empire breathing. This is their story, and it's not glamorous. It begins with the royal road, the famed highway stretching from Sardis in Anatolia to Susa in Elam. A marvel of engineering for its time, it covered approximately 1,677 miles and was maintained with a level of discipline that bordered on obsession. Guard posts watched its curves, inns dotted its length, relay stations known as chapakane housed fresh horses and food. Darius, always precise, was said to have declared, "There is no excuse for delay." But speed came at a cost. The Piradasish were not soldiers. They were not nobles. They were state functionaries, professional riders selected for endurance and reliability, not for glory. Clad in rough tunics, often traveling alone, they rode day and night, changing horses every 15-20 miles. A typical message from Susa to Sardis, normally a 3-month journey on foot, could arrive in 7 days. Greek historian Herodotus marveled at their efficiency, writing, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course." But he didn't mention the sores, the bandits, or the isolation. A courier might ride through blistering deserts by day and freezing passes by night. Scorpions in the plains, wolves in the highlands. If he lost a satchel, he could be executed. If he arrived late, he might be flogged. And if he misdelivered a message, that was treason. Each rider carried an official satchel stamped with the seal of the king. Inside were clay tablets, scrolls, or leather-strapped bundles containing edicts, tax instructions, or military orders. Some messages were written in cuneiform, others in Aramaic, the empire's lingua franca. Most were short and absolute. The harvest of Babylon will be inspected. The satrap of Bactria must report tribute. The Ionian fleet is to be summoned, but the message itself mattered less than getting it there. At the Shapar stations, fresh horses were kept in shifts, sometimes 2, sometimes a dozen, depending on the importance of the route. Horses were the best the empire could buy. Nisaean chargers bred in Media, known for their power and speed. Stables were stocked with fodder, water, and replacement gear. Riders barely dismounted, just enough time to swing themselves onto the next mount and gallop off again. The logistics were staggering. To maintain this system, the empire employed farriers, stable hands, scribes, station masters, and guards. Each message left a paper trail, arrival logs, timestamps, seal confirmations. A delay at one station triggered inquiries from another. If a courier failed to arrive, the blame might fall on the station, the satrap, or the messenger's family. In many ways, the Persian postal system was not just about delivering mail. It was about proving that the empire still functioned. But for all its precision, the system was not immune to trouble. During the harsh winter months, routes through the Zagros Mountains became nearly impassable. In years of heavy snow, entire sections of the road were abandoned. One record mentions a courier found frozen on a mountain path, the letter still clenched in his hand, his horse wandering nearby. Bandit attacks were another threat. Though the road was patrolled, outlaws preyed on isolated riders, especially near imperial borders or during times of unrest. One courier, robbed of his satchel near the Armenian highlands, was spared by his attackers, but returned to Susa limping and terrified. His punishment? Public whipping, despite his pleas. Yet couriers kept riding. Some did it for the small salary, others for the housing offered at the Shapar, some perhaps out of a quiet sense of pride, that they were part of something vast and unseen, that without them the empire would not speak. There were even ranking systems among couriers, elite riders. Those trusted with the king's personal commands wore distinctive belts or armbands. They were given access to special routes and better food, but they also bore higher risk. To deliver a secret letter to a rebellious satrap could mean walking into a trap. Some never returned. Still, the system endured. Centuries later, even Alexander the Great, after conquering Persia, was so impressed with the infrastructure that he preserved much of it, repurposing the royal road for his own empire. But perhaps the real marvel wasn't the road or the horses. It was the couriers themselves, silent, dusty, anonymous figures galloping through history to carry a name, a number, a sentence, across an empire. Because at the end of it all, the empire's survival often depended not on generals or kings, but on whether a tired man could keep riding through the night. But what did it feel like to carry the will of an empire between your elbows? The Persian Piradasish was not just a messenger, he was the pulse of an empire. And in the mind of the Achaemenid rulers, a pulse had to beat with precision, not too slow, never out of rhythm, which is why the consequences of failure were so severe. Across the royal road and its branches, spanning from Sardis to Susa, Ecbatana to Persepolis, riders knew the stakes. They bore no swords, commanded no troops, but each carried something more dangerous than weapons, a message of authority. A missed dispatch could delay a tax shipment, a troop movement, or even a royal execution. One letter misplaced, and the machinery of empire jammed, so the system built around them was strict. If a courier missed his checkpoint by more than a few hours, the station master would record it and dispatch a report to the regional satrap, the governor. If that report reached the capital, the courier might face public punishment. Records describe fines, floggings, and in rare cases branding, a permanent mark on the hand or forearm, a literal sign that this man had failed the king. Yet the postal system wasn't designed to punish, it was designed to prevent, which is why layers of backup existed. Each route had replacement riders on standby. Each station had fresh horses, mules, and food stores. If a rider fell ill or vanished, another was launched without hesitation. The message mattered more than the man. Some stations even developed redundancy protocols, sending 2 couriers on. High-priority routes, one by the main road, another via alternate paths, especially during the rainy season or when political unrest brewed near borderlands. These couriers learned to read danger. If a village refused them water, they turned back. If a road was blocked by flooding, they navigated goat trails or cut through fields. They knew which towns had safe inns and which were better passed at night. They memorized the pace of their horses, when to push, when to slow. Some carried leather water flasks, others a pouch of dried fruit and goat cheese tucked beneath their robes. There was no glory in this, no applause, just endurance. In the city of Susa, administrators kept arrival boards, clay tablets placed near the Shapar gate, listing the names and origins of incoming couriers. Scribes marked times to the hour. Delays were noted, explained, and escalated. These records, dry and terse, now offer historians rare insights. Messenger from Sardis. Arrived at second hour late by half day. Horse lame. Message from Ecbatana failed to arrive, second courier sent. Courier brought incorrect seal, message refused. Even something as small as a smudged seal or torn satchel could mean rejection. Some satraps, obsessed with protocol, refused to even open a scroll unless the wax bore the correct insignia. The courier was then ordered to return and fetch a corrected copy, sometimes adding weeks to the exchange. Yet, despite all the obstacles, the system worked. And empire of dozens of languages, hundreds of ethnic groups, and thousands of miles remained coherent, because the information moved, and sometimes that information meant life or death. During the Ionian Revolt, 499-493 BCE, messages from coastal governors had to reach the king within days. Couriers rode nearly without rest, slipping through areas under siege or under watch. One message, from Sardis, warning of a fleet preparing to defect, arrived in Susa just as the king was planning a ceremonial banquet. The king cancelled the feast and ordered immediate retaliation. That message, on a strip of treated leather, was found centuries later, still sealed, in the ruins of a regional archive, but not every courier served politics. Many carried messages between merchants, nobles, and temples. These private messages, though subject to scrutiny, helped keep the empire's economy alive. Orders for timber, gold, horses, or textiles all traveled on horseback. Without them, supply chains collapsed. Some wealthy families even hired unofficial couriers, smuggling messages past imperial censors. These riders, if caught, could face exile or execution, but the risk was worth it, especially for those entangled in palace politics or provincial revolts. In one recorded case, a satrap's wife allegedly used a courier to send love letters to a rival general. When discovered, the courier was flogged and the general reassigned to the edge of the empire, in a station where no courier ever arrived again. Such stories only heightened the mystery of the riders. They were feared and respected. Inns kept rooms reserved for them. Farmers offered water without question. Even bandits, according to rumor, avoided killing couriers outright, believing it brought a curse. A folk saying in Cappadocia warned, "He who slays the king's whisperer will lose his tongue to the wind." But even superstition couldn't always save them. Some couriers disappeared forever, lost in snowdrifts, swallowed by flash floods, caught in tribal uprisings. Their names never entered any book. But the system didn't pause. The road always waited. Another rider would follow, and so the couriers kept moving, through forests and plains, across rivers and deserts, beneath sun and starlight, carrying a message that was never their own for a king they'd never meet, because the empire needed to be heard. But was the voice of empire ever theirs to understand? By the time the Persian Empire reached its zenith under Xerxes, the royal road had become more than a marvel of logistics. It was a symbol of the empire's will. Every rider that galloped down its dusty spine, every scroll that passed between trembling fingers, every hoofbeat echoing through mountain passes, they all carried a single silent message. The empire is watching. The empire remembers. The empire moves. But as with all systems built on perfection, cracks began to form. The farther from the capital a courier rode, the less control the empire had. Some satrapies, the vast administrative regions governed by local rulers, began manipulating the system. They delayed messages they didn't like. They rewrote scrolls before passing them on. Some even intercepted royal decrees and replaced them with forged versions tailored to their own ambitions. This made the lives of the Piradasish even more perilous. A courier might ride into a satrap's court bearing a royal reprimand, only to find himself imprisoned before he could dismount. Others were bribed, a few turned spies, but most remained, stubbornly loyal to their duty, even when caught in the crossfire of imperial politics. The court in Susa responded with more oversight. New rules required multiple copies of the same message to be sent by different routes. Couriers were instructed to memorize the contents of short messages, so even if the scroll was stolen or destroyed, the words would survive. Some carried coded scripts, texts that could only be understood by those with matching keys kept in. Sealed archives. Still, the wear on the system was visible. Some Shapa stations fell into disrepair. Horses were poorly fed. Roads, once smooth and patrolled, became pitted with ruts. Bandits grew bolder. The empire stretched thin across rebellions. Hand wars couldn't maintain its arteries, and yet the couriers rode on. We have their names only in fragments. A few scratched into clay tablets, a handful written in Greek chronicles or buried in administrative documents. Men like Artaphernes of Sardis, who carried a message from Darius to the Egyptian satrap in record time, only to collapse upon delivery. Miters of Arbela, who crossed 3 mountain ranges during winter to deliver a warning about a troop rebellion. Tukra of Ragai, who disappeared between stations and was later found wandering, scroll intact, delirious from thirst. These were not generals or kings, but without them, no empire, no matter how vast, could function for long. Even the enemies of Persia recognized their brilliance. When Alexander the Great defeated Darius III and marched through Susa and Persepolis, he preserved the courier network. His generals marveled at the system, adapting it to their own campaigns. The royal road became a Macedonian road. The Shapar became a Hellenic station. But the bones of the Persian system remained. Later empires borrowed even more. The Romans built their cursus publicus on Persian foundations. The Mongols created a relay system eerily similar to the Piradasish known as the Yam. Even in medieval Europe, royal couriers followed routes inspired by roads first carved into the soil by Persian hooves. The Persian couriers never built monuments. They never signed laws. They rarely received honors, but they left a legacy of movement and memory, etched into every empire that came after. And perhaps that is their greatest testament. that in a world before telegraphs, before radios, before satellites and fiber optics, the survival of a superpower depended on a man, a horse and a scroll. And when that man reached the edge of the world, wind-chafed and exhausted, he passed the scroll to another and turned to ride back. Into the dust, into the silence, into history, because the message had to go on. In the twilight stillness of a Ming dynasty courtyard, a young man adjusts his robes, checks his hairpin, and most carefully of all smooths his socks. Not his hat, not his collar, his socks. Because in Ming China, 1368-1644, where social order rested on ritual, hierarchy, and face, what you wore below the knee was far more than fashion. It was status, it was discipline, and sometimes it was survival. This is the quietly obsessive world of Ming dynasty footwear etiquette, where shoes could hint at rank, socks could betray shame, and even a wrinkle at the ankle might ripple into disgrace. Let's start with what's visible: the shoe. For scholars and gentry, shoes were typically made of black felt, hemp, or satin, depending on rank and season. The most formal were cloth shoes with upturned toes, stitched in patterns. That echoed Confucian aesthetics: symmetry, restraint, and sobriety. In summer, thin-soled shoes were preferred. In winter, padded interiors lined with rabbit fur. But the real subtlety was in the sock, or lu-lu. In elite circles, socks were expected to be white, immaculately clean, and precisely fitted. Sloppiness suggested laziness. Stains hinted at moral failure. A sagging sock? A sign of poor upbringing. If your sock bunched above the ankle or peaked unevenly above the shoe line, it could be interpreted as a lapse in filial piety, as if you weren't well raised enough to dress properly in front of your elders. One etiquette guide from the Wanli. Dare goes so far as to instruct, a gentleman's foot must walk not before his name, and his sock must show neither sloth nor boast. This was no metaphor. Footwear truly reflected one's identity. In imperial exams, the grueling civil service tests that defined Ming bureaucracy, examinees were observed not only for knowledge, but for deportment, including dress. A young scholar who arrived with dirty socks or loud-colored shoes might be marked down in final assessments. In some rare cases, examiners ordered candidates to remove their shoes for inspection, a gesture humiliating to anyone who dared cut corners. So, why did socks matter so much? Partly it was about cleanliness and composure, key Confucian values. But there was also a belief rooted in both Neo-Confucian and Taoist traditions that order began with the body, and that clothing the body was a sacred, moral act. To dress was to honor your parents, your ancestors, your teacher, and your station. And so socks became a battleground of self-discipline. Young boys in elite families were trained to fold their socks correctly before sunrise, aligning them perfectly by their bedding. Servants were scolded not just for dirty floors, but for failing to spot socklint on a master's heels. Some households kept a second pair of indoor socks, changed before meals with elders as a gesture of respect. In rare ceremonial moments, sock changes were symbolic, akin to purification. But footwear wasn't only for the scholar class. Laborers wore rough hemp or grass shoes, often barefoot beneath. Soldiers wore leather boots, sometimes with wrapped linen beneath. And among women, especially those of higher rank, socks became even more intricate, particularly with the practice of foot binding. Though foot binding predates the Ming dynasty, it became increasingly stylized during this period. Socks for bound. Feet were painstakingly hand-stitched, tiny, decorative, and made to be glimpsed, never fully seen. Noble women might have a dozen pairs embroidered with poems or stitched in silk, changed multiple times a day to reflect the season or the guest list. In some households, socks were among the first textiles a girl learned to sew, and the care she took in making them was judged alongside her cooking, calligraphy, and needlework. Meanwhile, in merchant homes, anxious to rise in status, socks became a tool of aspirational signaling. Records from Hangzhou mention wealthy cloth dealers who ordered imitation scholar socks for their sons, crafted in white cotton with polished seams to mimic the satin of officials. These boys wore the socks proudly. until they tried to enter official schools, where one examiner allegedly tore a boy's sock seam in front of the class and barked, "Status is not stitched." It wasn't just vanity, it was survival. To be seen in the wrong footwear, especially during a festival, a court appearance, or an audience, could result in reprimands, ridicule, or worse. One minor official in Nanjing lost his post after attending a funeral in blue socks, a color associated with joy rather than mourning. Another scholar's promotion was delayed after he wore high boots to an indoor tea ceremony, considered vulgar and martial. Even poets weighed in. One Ming verse reads, "His robe was as ink, his shoes as night, but oh, his sock did sag with spite." What use is scroll or sacred book if you forget the care you took? So next time you pull on socks in haste, think of the scholar boy smoothing linen in dawn's quiet, the merchant wife sewing perfect seams in hopes of respect, or the trembling clerk hoping his spotless heel might carry him into service. Because in Ming China, your path to honor began not with words or weapons, but with a clean, quiet foot. But what happens when a wrinkle, a color, or a stitch risks ruining your family name? The further we walk into the world of Ming Dynasty etiquette, the more clearly we see a society obsessed with what was hidden beneath the surface. Nowhere was this more literal than in the rules of dress below the waist, and most particularly in the quiet battlefield of sock and shoe decorum. For men of rank, especially officials and scholars, daily rituals began with feet. There was a hierarchy to the act of dressing itself. After bathing and donning the underrobe, socks were next, pulled on slowly with care to avoid wrinkles, misalignment, or loose threads. Improperly donned socks weren't just a matter of comfort. They were interpreted as evidence of disorder, even moral laxity. This belief was institutionalized. In Ming court protocol, inspection ceremonies were regularly conducted before formal processions. These didn't just assess robes and hair. Officials' socks and shoes were observed for cleanliness and conformity. Guards at court gates could deny entry to anyone whose garments suggested carelessness. Records show that some officials, humiliated by public correction, resigned within the week. To us, it may sound harsh, but to the Ming mind, this was harmony in motion. A person who could not dress himself properly could not be trusted to rule others. That's why socks and shoes were often mentioned in official censures. A scathing reprimand from a provincial governor survives in which he calls a minor bureaucrat a man whose ankles speak before he does. It was an insult with layers. The officials' slouched socks were seen not only as personal untidiness, but as a lack of reverence for rank, place, and occasion. The same expectations extended into the home. In Confucian households, children were expected to show their upbringing through their appearance. It was common for a father to assess a son's readiness for schooling, not just by his writing brush, but by inspecting the folds of his inner garments and the neatness of his white linen socks. If they sagged, he might conclude the child was not yet prepared to learn discipline, or worse, that the mother had failed in her duties of instruction. This placed enormous pressure on women in core gentry and upper merchant households. Women bore the responsibility for household refinement, and socks were a part of that. Mothers were judged on the seamwork of their sons' socks, the sturdiness of their husbands' soles, the softness of the fabric offered to guests. A bride might be evaluated by her new mother-in-law based on the sock pairs she embroidered for dowry. This expectation even extended to funerals. Mourning attire called xiaofu included specific rules for footwear. Socks had to be plain, unadorned, and slightly loose to represent the humility and looseness of spirit during grief. But they could not be dirty or sloppily tied, lest one dishonor the dead. A funeral in Suzhou reportedly drew gossip after the deceased's grandson appeared in newly whitened socks, too bright, too proud. The family endured shame for months. Even the criminal courts paid attention to footwear. A case from the Ming legal code tells of a man who appeared before a magistrate, accused of theft. Before the questioning began, the judge noted the man's oddly colored socks, green, not the customary black or white for his class. The inconsistency led to questions, which revealed the socks were stolen. The man confessed, unraveled quite literally by his feet. But not all the footwear stories from the Ming were tragedies. Some were aspirational. Poor scholars in remote towns sometimes polished their socks with chalk dust, hoping to mimic the bright whites of the elite. One aspiring candidate reportedly stitched his name into the cuff of his socks, not out of pride, but to remind himself as he dressed each morning that he must carry the family's name with every step. Even theatre reflected these values. The Ming stage, a well-dressed official would be introduced with a slow, deliberate step, meant to draw the audience's eyes to his spotless white socks, peeking from beneath flowing robes. Villains, in contrast, wore disheveled shoes, open-backed slippers or mismatched stockings. The audience needed only a glance to know the difference between honor and deceit. There were even idioms about it, a man who rose too quickly in rank. Without learning, humility was said to have socks that outrun his boots. Someone from a humble background who dressed too richly might be mocked with, "He walks on gold but sweats through linen," a reminder that appearances meant nothing. Without substance. Still, as social mobility crept upward, so too did anxiety. More families than ever sent sons into the exam halls, more sought appointments, and more tried to craft the perfect image, beginning with a properly made, properly worn sock. Which leads us to a quiet paradox. The Ming were a people who believed in vast systems of bureaucracy, scholarship, moral order. Yet they measured those systems not just in essays or laws, but in stitches, in seams, in the curve of a foot within a shoe. So what happened when your sock slipped? What did it mean to trip, however slightly, on the fabric of expectation? As the Ming dynasty marched through its final century, cracks formed not just in walls and armies, but in the very rituals meant to hold it all together. And among those rituals, dress, appearance, and yes, socks. At first glance it might seem absurd to tie the decline of an empire to the fading importance of proper footwear. But to the Ming, where order was everything, the gradual erosion of attention to the smallest protocols often reflected a deeper unraveling of societal harmony. Let's start with the elite. In late Ming court paintings and memorials, scholars are still depicted with pristine robes and impeccable posture, but increasingly, reports from ministers complain of sloppy decorum, especially among newly appointed officials. One famously stern court censor wrote in 1621, "The new mandarins arrive like rice husk scholars, flapping garments, dust on hems, and socks twisted like wine shop beggars." The insult was not merely visual, it was moral. Ming society had long upheld a Confucian ideal that one's outward appearance reflected inner virtue. When socks began to wrinkle, loosen, or vanish beneath boots, it wasn't just bad tailoring, it was the visible sign of inner decay. The middle classes, meanwhile, were also shifting. Merchants and landowners, newly wealthy, began borrowing styles and symbols of the scholarly elite. But they lacked formal instruction in courtly etiquette. As a result, they often made subtle mistakes. Colored socks worn to morning events, soft indoor slippers used for temple processions, or excessively perfumed cloth worn with humble robes. These missteps sparked criticism, but also envy. Because by the late 1500s, appearance was no longer just about virtue. It was about survival in a rigid system that was increasingly under strain. And then came the urban theaters, where comedians began to poke fun. On stage, actors portraying corrupt officials exaggerated their steps to flash overly bright or mismatched. Socks. In one play, a dishonest tax clerk is revealed not by a confession, but by his fine silk socks poking out beneath a peasant's robe, a jab at officials profiting from the poor. Audiences laughed, but they also nodded. The joke worked because everyone recognized the truth beneath the fabric. By the final decades of the dynasty, even imperial edicts took notice. A 1637 court bulletin chastised regional governors for lax inspections of ceremonial dress. Let not the men who bow to the Son of Heaven do so with uncovered ankles or dishonored hems. This was no idle reprimand. It reflected growing concern that ritual obedience, so central to Ming ideology, was eroding. And the erosion wasn't just cultural. The military, stretched thin by internal rebellion and Manchu incursions, became more pragmatic. Commanders allowed looser dress standards. Soldiers began favoring boots without socks or wrapping their feet in strips of cotton. Function replaced form. The old standards, once sacred, were now seen as burdensome, even dangerous. In the provinces, famine and flooding disrupted production. Socks, once handmade by wives and mothers, became less common, often reused until threadbare. Some families could no longer afford the cloth. Others chose practicality, thick leggings, straw sandals, or barefoot labor. And yet, even then, the idea of the sock persisted. In one surviving letter from a rural teacher to his pupil, he writes, "You may arrive in borrowed shoes, but your socks must be your own. Let them be clean even if patched. A man who tends his feet tends his fate." Even after the fall of the Ming in 1644, as the Qing dynasty rose and cultural norms shifted, many Confucian scholars, especially those in hiding or mourning, clung to Ming customs. Some refused to adopt Manchu dress. Others, in private defiance, kept Ming-style white socks folded among their few remaining possessions. One account from the early Qing tells of a reclusive poet who, though impoverished, still washed and mended his socks each morning, as if waiting for a summons that would never come. Because in a world collapsing around them, order, even in small things, was a way to preserve dignity. So what does a sock mean in the great sweep of history? It means that sometimes empires are not only held together by walls and warriors, but by rituals of daily discipline, by the unspoken rules that keep society walking in step. And when those rules fade, we notice not in revolutions, but in the tiny sounds of slipping heels and quiet, dragging seams. In the end, Ming socks were never just about feet. They were about form, about face, about belonging in a world where every detail mattered. And as that world unraveled, the last to fall were not the thrones or gates, but the rituals that began each morning with the careful smoothing of white linen, wrapped silently around a hopeful ankle. The long houses of medieval Scandinavia echoed with many sounds: crackling fires, clanging hammers, the low murmur of sagas. But buried in the rhythm of Norse village life was another sound, the confused murmuring of men trying to figure out what day it was, especially on Tuesdays. In the Viking Age, roughly 800 to 1100 CE, the Norse lived by both sun and story. Their world was ordered less by clocks or calendars and more by cycles of weather, feasts, tides, and battle seasons. But as Christianity crept into their world, so did something far more unsettling than missionaries or kings. The 7-day week and no day confused the Vikings more than Tuesday. To understand why, we need to return to how the Norse once marked time. Before Christianity, time was counted in moons, feast intervals, and seasonal shifts. A man might say, 3 nights past the high moon, or 2 turns since the goats gave birth. Daily life revolved around daylight, tasks, and oral tradition, not strict divisions of named days. There was no Monday, no Thursday, just work, weather, and war. But by the 10th century, as Christian missionaries gained influence, monasteries and royal courts began enforcing the Roman calendar system, including the 7-day week, an idea both foreign and, to many Norse, unsettling. Most of the week's names were eventually translated and adapted through Old Norse mythology. Sunday, Sunnudagur, Sun's Day; Monday, Mannadagur, Moon's Day; Wednesday, Odinsdagur, Odin's Day Thursday; Thorsdagur, Thor's Day Friday; Freyadagur, Freya or Frigg's Day Saturday; Laugardagur, Washing Day, Old Norse origin. But then came Tuesday, Tisdagur. Named after the Norse god Tyr, a warrior deity associated with law, order, and sacrifice. Tyr was revered, but also feared. He was the god who placed his hand in Fenrir's mouth, knowing it would be bitten off. His name evoked duty, blood, and the cold iron of justice. And now, every 7th sunrise, peasants and warriors alike were expected to observe a day in his name. To many Norse, this association felt heavy, uncomfortable. Tuesday quickly became synonymous with legal matters, property disputes, and trial by combat proceedings, all commonly scheduled for the 2nd day of the week in Christianizing settlements. In court records from Iceland's Althing, one of the world's earliest parliaments, Tuesday is repeatedly noted as a day for swearing oaths, settling land feuds, and performing outlaw judgments. These weren't casual tasks. To stand before the law speaker and speak your truth Knowing a false word might lead to exile or a duel in a frost-covered field was terrifying. And because Tuesday came every 7 days like clockwork, so did this quiet dread. A rune carving found near Uppsala reads, "Tears Day, 2 men fought, 1 did not rise." In effect, Tuesday became the empire's hangnail, a small, recurring pain that people came to fear not for what it was, but for what it meant, reckoning. And the confusion ran deeper. In regions where Norse and Christian calendars collided, Tuesday became a flashpoint for ritual overlap. Take, for example, the Christian practice of fasting on Tuesdays in some monastic communities. Local converts, misunderstanding the custom, began fasting for Tyr, offering quiet sacrifices or vows. Priests tried to correct this, but the association stuck. One Danish monk wrote in frustration, "They do not eat, for they think the one-handed god demands it." In farming settlements, folklore began attaching Tuesday to bad omens. Spinning thread on a Tuesday might result in tangled cloth. Butchering an animal on a Tuesday risked spoilage. Children born on a Tuesday were thought to be stubborn, unlucky, or prone to litigation. Even Viking raiders observed the taboo. A fragmentary saga tells of a ship captain who refused to set sail on Tisdaga, believing that doing so would lead to mutiny or storm. His crew waited an extra day, only to be overtaken. By rival raiders, his name lost to time, his superstition preserved in story. And this pattern, fear through association, confusion through cultural collision, only deepened as the Roman calendar spread. Farmers who once counted by moon phases now stared at wooden primstaves carved with runes for feast. Days and saints, market schedules shifted, church bells rang every 7 days, and still people asked, "Is today the day I must defend my land? Is today Tears Day?" Because if it was, they'd best be ready for court, for combat, or for silence. So how did Tuesday, a day meant to bring order, become a symbol of dread? And what happens to a people when time itself begins to carry the weight of anxiety? As the Roman calendar tightened its grip on Norse settlements in the 10th and 11th centuries, Tuesday became more than a day. It became a ritual pressure point, a hinge on which justice, fear, and fatalism swung. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the Icelandic Commonwealth, where weekly assemblies, things, formed the spine of local governance. Here every Tuesday brought a familiar scene. Low clouds gathering over a frostbitten field, men wrapped in cloaks, each bearing disputes, claims, or oaths on their lips. Tuesday was not a rest day. It was a reckoning day. According to preserved segments of the Grugas, Iceland's medieval law code, legal assemblies often began on Tuesday mornings. These included inheritance disputes, boundary declarations, and trial by oath rituals. In a land with no centralized military or standing police, law was enforced through custom and courage, and Tuesday was the court's chosen anvil. And anvil it was. To stand before the law speaker and make a sworn declaration required a kind of composure few men possessed. The law demanded not only truth, but performance. Hesitate and your enemies pounced. Mispronounce a formulaic phrase, and your case could be voided. One tale from the Landnámabók tells of a man named Hrani who, trembling under pressure on a Tuesday morning, misquoted his oath and was immediately stripped of his property. The phrase he forgot? "With Tyr as witness." Ironically, invoking the god of law on the day named for him was both tradition and trap. The psychological toll added up. Farmers would delay traveling if they knew a Tuesday ruling loomed. Markets emptied early the day before. Scribes and monks noted spikes in quarrels and duels midweek. Even saga writers, normally indifferent to the calendar, consistently timed climactic confrontations on a Tuesday. Never a coincidence. Always a signal. And then there was the ritual fatigue. As Christianity spread and saints' feast days were layered atop existing customs, overlap bred confusion. Some holy days fell on Tuesdays, leading to bizarre hybrid observances. One monk's diary describes a rural congregation honoring both Tyr and St. Felix in the same prayer session. He wrote, "They crossed themselves, then raised their fists to the sky, calling both mercy and vengeance into the room. Efforts to correct such practices failed. The church may have brought the calendar, but it could not erase the emotional logic of the Norse mind. Tuesday had already carved itself deep into the communal psyche. The fear wasn't just judicial, it was cosmic. Tyr, though a god of law, was not comfort. He was sacrifice incarnate. The only Norse god known to lose a limb for the sake of oaths, Tyr's presence in the calendar served as a weekly reminder of what must be given up for order, and people gave up much. Tuesdays were increasingly associated with land forfeiture. Many recorded confiscations occurred on Tuesdays, often after a failed court appearance, outlawry sentences. Men declared fjarbotamader, outlawed, typically learned their fate on this day. Duel announcements. Though not always fought on Tuesdays, challenges were often issued on them, giving Tuesday a taste of iron and dread. Even omens and dreams shifted. In folklore recorded by 19th century collectors from rural Norway and Iceland, dreams occurring on a Tuesday were believed to foretell personal loss. One legend claimed that dreaming of fire on a Tuesday meant you would be burned in court, that is, condemned or fined. Others believed that traveling on a Tuesday invited injury, especially if passing known Thingstead sites, locations, of historic courts. These beliefs were never codified. They didn't need to be. Like weather, they settled into the bones, and like weather, they influenced action. The result? A cultural rhythm of caution. Fewer new ventures began on Tuesdays. Marriages were almost never held, trade was slowed, building projects delayed. Even ships, those famously Viking vessels, were sometimes held back one day if the tide fell on a Tuesday. The longships feared the courtroom more than the storm. And what of Tyr himself? As Christianity solidified its hold, the gods of the Norse faded into legend. But Tyr, unlike Thor or Odin, was never fully mythologized. He wasn't sung about in drinking halls or carved into decorative weapons. He became instead a symbol of quiet, painful duty. A figure hidden in calendars and court rituals, spoken of more in lore than in legend. In time, his name endured only through the anxiety of a weekday. So how does a culture come to fear a day, not by decree, not by religion, but by the slow, weekly reminder that justice has a cost and that the calendar never forgets to call it due? By the waning centuries of the Viking Age, the Norse world was no longer what it had been. The great raiding expeditions had quieted. Kings claimed lineage from both Odin and Christ. Stone churches rose beside longhouses. Laws once carved in